Miss Marple and the Mystery of the Midnight Visitor. Section 2. The village of St. Mary Mead was abuzz with speculation, following the shocking discovery of Mr. Lonsdale's body. It was not every day that a murder occurred in such a peaceful corner of the English countryside, and the villagers, who thrived on gossip and intrigue, wasted no time in forming their own theories. At the grocer's, Mrs. Bartlett, the butcher's wife, leaned conspiratorially toward Mrs. Sims, a stout woman with a fondness for scandal. "A burglary, they say," Mrs. Bartlett whispered, eyes wide with excitement, "though I heard from young Tom Willis that nothing seems to have been taken." "Nothing?" Mrs. Sims clucked her tongue. "Then why kill the poor man? And what about that notebook they found beside him?" Mrs. Bartlett nodded sagely. "That's what I want to know. Could be something important in it. Something someone didn't want anyone else to see." Meanwhile, at the vicarage, Reverend Leonard Clement and his wife, Griselda, discussed the crime over breakfast. "A dreadful business," the vicar said, buttering his toast with a furrowed brow. "Mr. Lonsdale was not a particularly sociable man, but he did not strike me as someone who would be involved in, well, anything that would lead to murder." His wife, a lively woman with a sharp mind, tapped a finger against the rim of her teacup. "That depends, doesn't it? He was a barrister before he retired. He must have had plenty of enemies." The vicar sighed. "That was years ago, my dear. He lived quietly here." Griselda tilted her head. "Not so quietly. He had visitors, now and then. Only last week I saw a stranger leaving his house in the late evening. Someone I didn't recognize." "You didn't mention this before," the vicar said, startled. She shrugged. "I didn't think anything of it at the time." Across the village, Miss Marple sat in her tidy cottage, knitting needles clicking rhythmically as she reflected on the events of the morning. She had observed the villagers carefully, noting their reactions, their whispered conversations, their expressions of curiosity and fear. Murder had a way of unsettling even the most composed individuals, and Miss Marple had long since learned that in moments of distress people often revealed more than they intended. Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. "Come in," she called. The door opened to reveal Inspector Braddock, his face set in a grim expression. He stepped inside, removing his hat. "Miss Marple," he said, "I wonder if I might trouble you for a moment." She set aside her knitting. "Of course, Inspector. Tea?" Braddock hesitated, then nodded. "Thank you." As she poured, he cleared his throat. "I understand you took particular interest in that notebook found beside Mr. Lonsdale's body." Miss Marple smiled gently. "Merely an observation, Inspector. It seemed rather an unusual object to be left behind at the scene of a crime." Braddock sighed. "It is unusual. We've examined it, filled with what appear to be legal notes, but nothing obviously incriminating." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "Nothing obviously incriminating, you say?" Braddock gave a weary smile. "You know what I mean, Miss Marple. There are references to old cases, notes on various legal matters, but no names, no direct mentions of anything that would point to a motive for murder." Miss Marple sipped her tea. "And yet, someone went to great lengths to ensure Mr. Lonsdale would not speak again." Braddock exhaled. "Precisely. And that's where things get interesting. We've spoken to his housekeeper, Mrs. Turner. She claims he was uneasy the past few days, though he wouldn't say why." Miss Marple nodded. "I see." Braddock continued. "What's more, Mrs. Turner swears she heard voices last night. Mr. Lonsdale was speaking to someone shortly after midnight. She assumed it was a guest, but she didn't see who it was." Miss Marple's expression remained serene, but she tucked away this piece of information. "And what of the door?" Braddock raised an eyebrow. "What of it?" She set down her cup. "You see, Inspector, young Tom Willis found it slightly open this morning. That suggests the visitor was the last person to see Mr. Lonsdale alive, and if they left in such a hurry as to leave the door ajar, then surely they must have been quite distressed." Braddock nodded. "That's what I thought too. But distressed or not, they didn't take the notebook." Miss Marple's fingers hovered over her knitting. "No, Inspector, which means one of two things. Either they didn't realize its importance, or they believed it was safer to leave it behind." Braddock frowned. "Safer?" She gave a small smile. "Well, one might argue that if a person takes something from a crime scene, they risk being discovered with it later. But if they leave it and ensure no one suspects them—" Braddock leaned back. "They could come back for it later." Miss Marple nodded approvingly. Braddock tapped his fingers against his teacup. "That means our suspect might still be in the village." Miss Marple's expression turned thoughtful. "Oh, I think that's very likely." As the inspector left, Miss Marple resumed her knitting, her mind already sorting through the patterns of human behaviour she had observed over the years. Murder, she had always found, was rarely about the act itself. It was about the tangled relationships, the hidden resentments, the carefully concealed truths that lay beneath the surface of village life. And somewhere, hidden among the whispers of St. Mary Mead, was a murderer who had yet to make their final mistake. Miss Marple and the Mystery of the Midnight Visitor. Section 3. The quiet hum of village life persisted in St. Mary Mead, though beneath the surface an undercurrent of unease had taken hold. People still went about their daily business. Mrs. Bartlett still gossiped over the counter at the grocer's. The vicar still gave his weekly sermons, and gardeners still tended their hedges with meticulous care. But there was a tension in the air, a subtle stiffness in the way people spoke, as though fearful that their words might be misconstrued. The murder of Mr. Lonsdale had left its mark, and more importantly, it had set tongues wagging. At the post office, Miss Hartnell, a formidable woman with a penchant for scandal, had cornered Mrs. Price, the postmistress, with what she considered vital information. "You mark my words," Miss Hartnell said in a hushed tone, glancing over her shoulder, as if the murderer himself might be lurking in the next aisle. "This was no random crime. Lonsdale was a man with secrets. I always said so." Mrs. Price pursed her lips. "Oh? And what secrets might those be?" Miss Hartnell sniffed. "Well, for one thing, there was that mysterious visitor last week. A gentleman, smartly dressed, came into the village asking for directions to Lonsdale's house. I saw him myself. Looked terribly serious, businesslike." Mrs. Price frowned. "What did he look like?" "Oh, tall, dark-haired, quite distinguished, but not someone I recognized. Not a local, that's for sure. And he had an air about him. You know the type." Mrs. Price nodded sagely, though she wasn't entirely sure she did know the type. Meanwhile, at the police station, Inspector Braddock sat at his desk, his fingers drumming a steady rhythm against a stack of papers. Before him lay the notebook recovered from Lonsdale's study, its pages filled with neat, precise handwriting. He had spent hours poring over it, hoping to uncover something, anything that might provide a clue as to why the retired barrister had been murdered. But aside from legal notes and case summaries, there was nothing of apparent significance. Nothing, that is, until he reached the final page. There, scrawled in uneven script, as though written in haste, were a few cryptic lines. The visitor arrives at midnight. Cannot delay further. The answer is in the garden. Braddock's brow furrowed. The garden? What on earth had Lonsdale meant? A sharp knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. He looked up to find Sergeant Fletcher peering in. "Sir," Fletcher said, "Miss Marple is here to see you." Braddock straightened. "Send her in." Miss Marple entered, her demeanour as unhurried as ever, her gloved hands folded neatly before her. "Inspector," she said pleasantly, "I do hope I'm not intruding." "Not at all, Miss Marple. In fact, I was just thinking of you." Her blue eyes twinkled. "How flattering." Braddock gestured for her to sit, then hesitated. He had learned long ago that Miss Marple had a remarkable way of seeing what others did not. He slid the notebook across the desk. "This was found beside Mr. Lonsdale," he said. "Most of it is rather dry legal material, but the last entry is odd." Miss Marple adjusted her spectacles and read the passage carefully. She tapped a finger against the page. "Ah, how very interesting." Braddock leaned forward. "You have a theory?" She smiled. "Not a theory, Inspector, merely an observation. You see, when people are in distress, true distress, they tend to focus on what is most immediate. If Mr. Lonsdale wrote this shortly before his death, then I dare say the garden holds a significant clue." Braddock exhaled. "That's what I was thinking too." Miss Marple closed the notebook. "Well then, perhaps it would be wise to take a look." The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across Mr. Lonsdale's garden. As Miss Marple and Inspector Braddock stepped through the neatly trimmed hedges. It was a beautiful space, meticulously maintained. Rose bushes flourished in symmetrical beds, their blooms vibrant against the green. A stone pathway wound its way toward a small fountain, where water trickled in a soothing rhythm. At the far end of the garden, a wooden bench sat beneath an old oak tree, its gnarled branches reaching toward the sky. Miss Marple observed everything with a practised eye. She had always believed that gardens, much like people, had stories to tell. Braddock gestured to the flower beds. If Lonsdale mentioned the garden, he must have been referring to something here. The question is, what? They began a slow, methodical search, scanning the ground for anything unusual. The inspector crouched beside a bed of roses, carefully brushing aside leaves and soil. "Nothing here," he muttered. Miss Marple, however, had stopped near the old oak tree. Her gaze was fixed on the wooden bench beneath it. She moved closer, running a gloved hand along the worn surface. And then she saw it, a small jagged notch carved into the wood, fresh, unlike the weathered scratches that time had etched upon it. "Inspector," she called softly. Braddock joined her. "What is it?" She pointed to the mark. "This is new." Braddock frowned, running his fingers over it. "You're right. It looks like someone scraped something here recently." Miss Marple tilted her head. Or perhaps removed something. Braddock's expression darkened. If something was hidden here, it's gone now. Miss Marple nodded. Indeed, and I suspect that whatever it was, Mr. Lonsdale meant to retrieve it last night, before he was interrupted. Braddock straightened, which means the murderer must have known about it too. Miss Marple clasped her hands. Yes, Inspector, and that, I think, tells us something very important. Braddock gave her a sharp look. What's that? She smiled gently. It tells us that the killer is not some distant enemy from Mr. Lonsdale's past. No, Inspector, I believe the answer lies much closer to home. Braddock inhaled deeply, his mind already racing through the list of villagers who might have had access to this very spot. The killer was among them, and Miss Marple, as always, was already several steps ahead. Miss Marple and the Mystery of the Midnight Visitor. Section 4. The garden held its silence, disturbed only by the occasional rustle of leaves in the gentle afternoon breeze. Inspector Braddock stood with his hands on his hips, staring at the freshly carved notch on the wooden bench. It was small, easy to overlook, but significant in its implications. Whatever had once been concealed here was gone, and someone within the village had taken it. Miss Marple, ever composed, glanced up at the branches of the old oak tree. "This is a well-chosen hiding place," she murmured. "Far enough from the house to avoid casual attention, yet familiar enough to Mr. Lonsdale that he would remember it easily." Braddock nodded, rubbing his chin. "And if Lonsdale mentioned it in his final note, it means he intended to retrieve something just before he was murdered." Miss Marple's expression was thoughtful. "Exactly. But that leaves us with a pressing question. What was it?" Sergeant Fletcher, who had been scanning the area, straightened. "Do you think it was a document? A letter, perhaps?" Braddock exhaled sharply. It would make sense. If Lonsdale was being threatened or blackmailed, he might have hidden something important here for safekeeping. Miss Marple adjusted her gloves. Yes, and if the murderer knew about it, they would have retrieved it immediately after the crime. Which means, she paused, tilting her head slightly. Braddock frowned. Which means what? Miss Marple turned her gaze toward the house. Which means the murderer did not find it immediately. If they had, there would have been no need for such a hurried removal. Braddock's brow furrowed. "You mean the killer returned later?" "Precisely." She gave him a gentle smile. "And that is very telling, isn't it?" Braddock considered this. If the murderer had to return to the scene, it meant they were either interrupted during the crime or uncertain about what Lonsdale had hidden. Either way, it suggested a level of improvisation, something he had not expected. "I suppose," Braddock muttered, "we should start asking who was out and about last night." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "Yes, indeed, Inspector, but first we must consider something else. Who knew Mr. Lonsdale well enough to suspect he might have hidden something here?" Braddock nodded. "Only someone close to him, or someone who had reason to believe he possessed dangerous knowledge," Miss Marple added. Braddock straightened. "Then let's start questioning." Their first stop was the vicarage, a place of tranquillity where Reverend Leonard Hayward and his wife Beatrice resided. The Reverend was a tall, solemn man with an air of perpetual contemplation, while his wife was a lively woman with an eye for detail. They greeted Braddock and Miss Marple with polite curiosity, offering tea and, Scones before the conversation turned to Mr. Lonsdale. A terrible tragedy, Reverend Hayward sighed. I must say I was most shocked. Mr. Lonsdale attended church regularly, though he was never one for socializing. Beatrice Hayward, however, pursed her lips. Well, Leonard, I don't think that's quite fair. He was private, yes, but he had his visitors. Braddock's interest piqued. Visitors? She nodded. Why, only a week ago, a man came to see him. I saw them speaking in the garden. Miss Marple set her teacup down delicately. Would you describe him? Beatrice tapped her fingers thoughtfully against the table. Oh, he was well dressed, with a certain air of authority. Middle-aged, dark-haired, and oh, there was something else. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. Yes. Beatrice hesitated. He was carrying a briefcase. It looked rather official. Braddock exchanged a glance with Miss Marple. The same mysterious visitor Miss Hartnell had mentioned at the post office. Did you hear any of their conversation? Braddock asked. Beatrice shook her head. No, but Mr. Lonsdale looked troubled afterward, not his usual composed self at all. Braddock jotted down a note. A visitor with an official air. A briefcase. A worried Mr. Lonsdale. It was becoming increasingly clear that whatever had been hidden in the garden was important. Miss Marple, meanwhile, smiled kindly. And tell me, dear, did you notice if Mr. Lonsdale left his home later that evening? Beatrice blinked. Why, now that you mention it, I believe he did. I saw him through the window. He was wearing his coat and carrying a lantern. Braddock's pen paused mid-scratch. A lantern? Yes. It was quite late, nearly midnight, I'd say. He was heading towards the back of his garden. Miss Marple's expression did not change, but something in her eyes sharpened. Midnight, the precise time mentioned in Lonsdale's notebook. Braddock exhaled. That must have been when he was killed. Miss Marple sipped her tea. Yes, and that tells us something very interesting, doesn't it? Beatrice frowned. Does it? Miss Marple nodded. If he left his house willingly, it means he was not lured outside by force. He expected to meet someone. Braddock's jaw tightened. The murderer! Miss Marple inclined her head. Or at least someone he trusted enough to step out for. Reverend Hayward sighed. This is all so dreadful. Who could have done such a thing? Miss Marple's smile was gentle. I dare say, Reverend, we shall soon find out. As they left the vicarage, Braddock ran a hand through his hair. Lonsdale met someone in the garden at midnight. He was killed shortly after, and whatever he had hidden was taken later. Miss Marple nodded. Quite so. That means the murderer must have known about the hiding place, but only realized its importance after the crime. Miss Marple gave him a pleased look. Oh, very good, Inspector. You are beginning to see it clearly. Braddock sighed. Then our next question is, who would Lonsdale have agreed to meet at such an hour? Miss Marple adjusted her hat. I believe we must turn our attention to those he trusted most. People who were part of his daily life. Braddock exhaled. That means the doctor, his housekeeper, and Miss Marple clasped her hands, and perhaps even a friend or acquaintance from the village. Braddock glanced around the quiet streets of St. Mary Mead. Somewhere, among the ordinary facades and pleasant greetings, a murderer was keeping their secret. Miss Marple, however, had already set her mind on the next step. It was all a matter of human nature, after all, and she had spent a lifetime observing it. Miss Marple and the Mystery of the Midnight Visitor. Section 5. The village of St. Mary Mead had an air of restless curiosity following Mr. Lonsdale's murder. The usual gossip, which typically revolved around garden shows and whose scones were the flakiest, had turned dark. The townsfolk whispered in hushed tones, theories flying between them like birds in a hedge. Yet, amidst the conjecture and speculation, only one person quietly observed, noting the patterns of human nature as she always had. Miss Marple sat in her sunny parlour, her knitting needles clicking rhythmically as she reflected on the facts. Mr. Lonsdale had ventured out at midnight, willingly. He had expected to meet someone, and that someone had killed him. But the true puzzle lay in what had been hidden in the garden, and why it had been removed after the murder. Inspector Braddock, ever the practical man, had suggested they speak with those closest to Mr. Lonsdale. The doctor, his housekeeper, and any other acquaintances who might have held his confidence. Miss Marple, of course, had already formed her own list of likely suspects. That was why, when there came a sharp knock at the door, she was not at all surprised to find Dr. Henry Gilbert standing there, his usually composed face lined with tension. Miss Marple, he said, stepping inside after her invitation. I hope I'm not disturbing you? Not at all, dear doctor. Would you care for some tea? He shook his head impatiently. No, thank you. I must say, this business with Mr. Lonsdale is most unsettling. I feel I must unburden myself of something, and I believe you might be the only person who will listen without judgment. Miss Marple's hands continued their steady knitting. That is very kind of you to say, Dr. Gilbert. Please, go on. The doctor exhaled, as though summoning courage. You see, the day before Mr. Lonsdale's death, he came to my surgery. He was unusually tense, distracted even. At first I assumed it was some minor health concern, but when I pressed him, he confided in me. Miss Marple's knitting slowed ever so slightly. Confided? Dr. Gilbert nodded. Yes, he told me he had received a visitor, someone from his past, a man he had not seen in many years. He wouldn't say who, but he was greatly disturbed by it. Miss Marple's expression remained calm. How very interesting. Dr. Gilbert hesitated. He said the man had given him something that, in his words, changed everything. Miss Marple's knitting came to a full stop. Did he say what it was? The doctor shook his head. No, but he was afraid, Miss Marple, afraid in a way I had never seen before. He asked me a strange question. If a man has been presumed dead for years, but then reappears, what should one do? Miss Marple blinked. Oh my! Dr. Gilbert sighed. I told him that legally it would depend on the circumstances. But he seemed more concerned with the moral implications. He left in a hurry, saying he had something to take care of. Miss Marple set her knitting aside. Doctor, do you believe this visitor was somehow connected to his murder? Dr. Gilbert hesitated. I don't know, but I do know that Mr. Lonsdale was not a man given to exaggeration. If he was afraid, there was a reason for it. Miss Marple nodded. Thank you for telling me, Doctor. You have been very helpful. He gave her a troubled look. Do you think the police should know? Miss Marple smiled kindly. "Oh, I expect Inspector Braddock will hear about it soon enough." As the doctor left, Miss Marple sat quietly for a moment, absorbing the implications. A visitor from the past, a man presumed dead, a mysterious object that had changed everything. And then murder at the police station. Inspector Braddock paced his office, his temper flaring. "I swear, Miss Marple, every time we think we're getting closer, another complication arises." Miss Marple sat primly in the chair opposite him. "But complications are rather helpful, don't you think? They separate what is true from what is merely misleading." Braddock scowled. "Dr. Gilbert's story certainly complicates things. If Lonsdale's past had caught up with him, that widens our suspect pool considerably." Miss Marple sipped her tea. "Not necessarily, Inspector. It simply means we must look more closely at those around him." Braddock sighed. "Well, let's see where we stand. We know Lonsdale had a visitor a few days before his death, someone who unsettled him. That same day, he spoke to Dr. Gilbert and hinted at a long-lost acquaintance returning." Miss Marple nodded. "And let us not forget the mysterious briefcase. Our visitor was seen carrying one." Braddock drummed his fingers on the desk. "Which means there's a document involved, a will, a confession?" "Perhaps," Miss Marple mused, "or something more personal." Braddock frowned. "You're thinking of blackmail?" Miss Marple smiled. "I am thinking of secrets, Inspector, and what people will do to protect them." Braddock sighed. "Then we need to find out who this visitor was." Miss Marple nodded. "Yes, and I believe we need to ask the housekeeper, Mrs. Longley, a few more questions." Mrs. Longley was a woman of formidable presence, with a sharp gaze and an even sharper tongue. She met them at the door of Lonsdale's home, arms crossed. "You've more questions, then?" she said gruffly. Braddock nodded. "Just a few more." Miss Marple smiled kindly. "Mrs. Longley, you told us before that Mr. Lonsdale had no regular visitors, but are you quite certain of that?" Mrs. Longley hesitated. He was a private man," Braddock pressed. "Did he seem nervous recently?" She hesitated again, then exhaled. "He did receive a letter last week. Seemed shaken after reading it." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "Do you know what it said?" Mrs. Longley shook her head. "No, but he burned it in the fireplace immediately after." Braddock exchanged a glance with Miss Marple. "A visitor from the past," Miss Marple murmured. "A letter that left him shaken. And a hiding place in the garden." Braddock muttered, "We're missing something." Miss Marple smiled. "Not for long, Inspector. Not for long at all. Good. Miss Marple and the Mystery of the Midnight Visitor." Section 6. The chill of the evening had begun to settle over St. Mary Mead as Miss Marple left Mr. Lonsdale's cottage. The conversation with Mrs. Longley had been most enlightening. A letter. One that had shaken Mr. Lonsdale enough for him to destroy it immediately. A visitor, perhaps from the past, who had sent him into such a state of distress that he had consulted Dr. Gilbert. And then, of course, the hidden package in the rose garden, which had vanished after the murder. Miss Marple walked at a leisurely pace down the narrow village lane, lost in thought. To the casual observer, she looked like nothing more than a pleasant old lady enjoying an evening stroll. But behind her mild blue eyes, her mind was piecing together the puzzle, sorting through the layers of deception that had been so carefully woven. She paused outside the vicarage, hesitating for only a moment before knocking on the door. Within seconds the door opened, and Reverend Leonard Clement beamed at her. "Ah, Miss Marple! What a lovely surprise! Do come in. Griselda has just put on some tea." Miss Marple stepped inside, smiling warmly. The vicarage was always a welcoming place, and she knew that amidst the friendly conversation and tea she might glean an insight or two. Griselda, the vicar's cheerful and slightly scatterbrained wife, bustled in from the kitchen, balancing a tray. "Oh, Miss Marple, have you come to discuss the dreadful business with Mr. Lonsdale? It's all anyone in the village can talk about." Miss Marple accepted a cup of tea with a gracious nod. Yes, such a tragic affair. One wonders what could have led to such an event in our peaceful little village. The vicar sighed, stirring his tea. "I must confess, I was quite fond of Mr. Lonsdale. He was reserved but kind. I can hardly think of anyone who would want to harm him." Griselda scoffed. "Oh, Leonard, don't be naive. Everyone has secrets, even dear old Mr. Lonsdale. I heard from Mrs. Edgecombe that he had a scandalous past." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "Oh, and what sort of scandalous past?" Griselda leaned in conspiratorially. "Well, nothing too wild, I suppose, but Mrs. Edgecombe swears he once had a fiancée, years ago, before he came to St. Mary Mead, and apparently she disappeared under mysterious circumstances." Miss Marple's hands stilled on her teacup. "Disappeared, you say?" The vicar sighed. "Now, Griselda, you know how these things get exaggerated. I believe the story was that the young lady broke off the engagement and left a town rather suddenly. Hardly a disappearance. But Mrs. Edgecombe said there were rumours that she met with some kind of accident," Griselda insisted. Miss Marple tapped a finger thoughtfully against the rim of her teacup. A long-lost fiancé, a disappearance, and now a murder. Could it be connected? She looked at the vicar. "Do you recall the name of this young lady?" He furrowed his brow in thought. "I believe her name was Margaret Ashford, if memory serves." Miss Marple smiled kindly, but her mind was racing. Margaret Ashford. A name from the past, and perhaps a key to the mystery. Inspector Braddock was not pleased to see Miss Marple walk into the police station later that evening. He had, by now, resigned himself to her quiet but relentless involvement in the case. But it did not make it any easier for him. "Let me guess," he said gruffly, setting aside his notes. "You've uncovered something new." Miss Marple beamed at him. "Why, yes, Inspector. It seems Mr. Lonsdale was once engaged to a young woman named Margaret Ashford." Braddock's brows rose. "And she disappeared," Miss Marple said gently, "though there are conflicting stories about what really happened." Braddock sat back, frowning. "You think this Margaret Ashford has something to do with the murder?" Miss Marple clasped her hands. "Not necessarily. But if she were to have resurfaced, or if someone connected to her had, it might explain why Mr. Lonsdale was so troubled before his death." Braddock sighed heavily. "All right, I'll look into it." The next morning, Braddock arrived at Miss Marple's cottage, with an expression that suggested both exasperation and reluctant admiration. "Well, Miss Marple, you were right to be curious. I made some inquiries about this Margaret Ashford. Miss Marple set down her knitting, eyes bright with interest. "Oh?" Braddock nodded grimly. "She vanished nearly 30 years ago. Her disappearance was never officially classified as a crime, but there were whispers that Mr. Lonsdale knew more than he let on." Miss Marple sighed. "Poor Mr. Lonsdale. And now, all these years later, someone from that past returns, and he is murdered." Braddock rubbed his temples. "The question is, why now? Why, after 3 decades, would this resurface?" Miss Marple smiled. "Because, Inspector, the past never stays buried forever, and secrets have a way of coming to light, especially in a place as small as St. Mary Mead. Miss Marple and the Mystery of the Midnight Visitor." Section 7. The morning air was crisp as Miss Marple made her way through the village, her mind occupied with Inspector Braddock's latest revelation. Margaret Ashford had vanished decades ago, and now, after all these years, Mr. Lonsdale was dead. What had resurfaced from the past that was dangerous enough to cost him his life? As she passed the grocer's, Miss Marple caught sight of Mrs. Edgecombe chatting animatedly with Mr. Phelps, the butcher. Their heads were close together, and their expressions grave. Gossip was spreading like wildfire, as it always did in St. Mary Mead. Miss Marple knew that listening carefully to such chatter could be most enlightening. She paused just near enough to hear, without appearing to eavesdrop. "I tell you, it's no coincidence," Mrs. Edgecombe was saying in a hushed voice. "That woman arrives, and not a week later, poor Mr. Lonsdale is dead." Miss Marple's ears perked up. "A woman?" Mr. Phelps frowned. "You mean that lady from the inn? What's her name, Mrs. Westfield?" Mrs. Edgecombe nodded vigorously. "Mark my words, she's up to no good, always asking questions about Mr. Lonsdale. And she looked ever so distressed when she heard about his murder." Miss Marple did not linger. Instead, she made her way towards the village inn with renewed determination. The Rose and Crown Inn was a charming establishment, its ivy-covered walls and flower boxes giving it an air of warm hospitality. Miss Marple stepped inside, greeting the innkeeper, Mr. Tompkins, with a cheerful nod. "Good morning, Mr. Tompkins. I wonder if you might help me with a small matter." The stout man beamed at her. "Why, of course, Miss Marple. What can I do for you? I heard there was a new guest staying here. Mrs. Westfield, I believe. I happened to overhear that she had taken a particular interest in Mr. Lonsdale." Mr. Tompkins's friendly expression faltered. "Ah, well, yes. She arrived about a week ago. Seemed to know Mr. Lonsdale from somewhere, though he never mentioned her to me." Miss Marple clasped her hands together. "Would it be terribly improper of me to ask if she's in?" Mr. Tompkins hesitated for a brief moment, then sighed. "Well, I suppose there's no harm in it. She's in the sitting-room just now, having her breakfast." Miss Marple smiled warmly. "How very kind of you." Mrs. Westfield was a woman of about 50, her face lined with a sorrow that seemed to have settled deep within her. She looked up as Miss Marple approached, her expression wary. "Forgive me for intruding," Miss Marple said kindly, "but I understand you knew Mr. Lonsdale." Mrs. Westfield hesitated, then gestured toward the chair opposite her. "Please sit." Miss Marple did so, folding her hands in her lap. "I am Jane Marple. I live here in the village, and well, I often find myself rather interested in human nature. I could not help but notice that you seemed most distressed upon hearing of Mr. Lonsdale's passing." Mrs. Westfield exhaled slowly. Yes, I was." Miss Marple tilted her head slightly. "Had you known him long?" There was a long pause before Mrs. Westfield answered. "A lifetime ago," she murmured, "and under a different name." Miss Marple's pulse quickened. "Ah," she said softly, "would that name by any chance be Margaret Ashford?" Mrs. Westfield's eyes widened in shock. She clutched the edge of the table. How do you know that name?" Miss Marple's voice remained gentle. "Because, my dear, I believe you are the reason Mr. Lonsdale was so troubled before his death." Mrs. Westfield swallowed hard. "I never meant to cause him distress. I only came to find out the truth." Miss Marple nodded encouragingly. "The truth?" Mrs. Westfield's voice shook. "I disappeared all those years ago because I was afraid. Something terrible happened, and I never knew if Mr. Lonsdale was involved. I needed to know." Miss Marple's eyes never left hers. "What terrible thing?" Mrs. Westfield lowered her voice. "A death. My own brother, Henry Ashford. He drowned one summer night. Accident, they said. But I was never convinced," Miss Marple frowned. "And you suspected Mr. Lonsdale?" Mrs. Westfield hesitated. "Not at first, but after Henry's death I found a letter, one that suggested Mr. Lonsdale had secrets of his own. I was young, afraid, and I fled. Now, after all these years, I found another letter, hidden in an old trunk, suggesting that my brother's death was no accident." Miss Marple felt a chill run down her spine. "And you came back to confront Mr. Lonsdale?" Mrs. Westfield nodded. "I wrote to him first. I thought if he had answers, he would tell me. But when I arrived, he seemed so frightened. He refused to speak to me about it. And now he's dead." Miss Marple sat in thoughtful silence. "Mrs. Westfield, do you still have this letter?" She hesitated, then reached into her handbag and handed over a folded piece of paper. Miss Marple opened it carefully, her keen eyes scanning the faded ink. The words leaped out at her. "It was never meant to happen. I swear I did not intend for Henry to die. But the past cannot be undone. The secret must remain." Miss Marple inhaled sharply. The past, a secret, a life lost, and now another death to keep it buried. She folded the letter carefully. "Mrs. Westfield, I do believe the answer lies in the past, and I fear that whoever killed Mr. Lonsdale will not stop if they think you are close to uncovering the truth." Mrs. Westfield's face paled. "You mean—" "I could be next." Miss Marple met her gaze firmly. "I do believe you are in grave danger, my dear. Miss Marple and the Mystery of the Midnight Visitor." Section 8. Miss Marple left the Rose and Crown Inn with a deep sense of unease. Mrs. Westfield, Margaret Ashford, had returned to St. Mary Mead in search of the truth, but instead she had stirred up old ghosts and, quite possibly, provoked a murderer. If her brother's death had indeed been no accident, then someone had been desperate to keep that secret buried for over 30 years. And now another life had been taken to protect it. As she walked through the village, her mind pieced together the fragments of the puzzle. The letter Mrs. Westfield had found was damning, but it did not name names. If Mr. Lonsdale had been involved in Henry Ashford's death, Why would he have written such a letter at all? Guilt? A confession to himself? Or had someone else written it? Someone who had reason to be afraid of the past being uncovered? She was still lost in thought when she nearly collided with Dr. Latimer outside his surgery. "Ah, Miss Marple, my apologies. I was just on my way to see Mrs. Lonsdale." "Miss," Marple raised her eyebrows. "Mrs. Lonsdale? Is she unwell?" Dr. Latimer sighed, adjusting his glasses. "Not unwell, precisely, but terribly distraught, as you might imagine. I'm concerned about her. She's been having difficulty sleeping since her husband's death, and she seems unusually anxious. I suppose grief affects us all differently." Miss Marple's mind sharpened. Anxiety was to be expected, of course, but what if it was not simply grief that troubled Mrs. Lonsdale? Do you know if she was aware of Mr. Lonsdale's past connections? To Margaret Ashford, for instance? Dr. Latimer blinked in surprise. Margaret Ashford? Good heavens, that name does sound familiar. Wait, wasn't she the girl who disappeared after her brother drowned all those years ago? Miss Marple nodded. "Indeed, and she has returned to the village. She spoke to Mr. Lonsdale just before he was murdered." Dr. Latimer frowned deeply. "That is unsettling. Do you think there's a connection?" Miss Marple's blue eyes twinkled. "My dear Dr. Latimer, I very much suspect that everything is connected." Miss Marple arrived at Lonsdale House just as Dr. Latimer was finishing his visit. Mrs. Lonsdale stood at the doorway, her black mourning dress making her pale face seem even more drawn. Miss Marple inclined her head. "My dear, I do hope I am not disturbing you." Mrs. Lonsdale offered a faint smile. "Not at all, Miss Marple. Would you like to come in?" She led Miss Marple into the sitting-room, where a single lamp cast flickering light across the walls. The air inside was heavy with the scent of lilies, and Miss Marple noticed that the curtains were drawn tightly shut, though it was still daylight. Mrs. Lonsdale lowered herself into a chair with a deep sigh. "Dr. Latimer says I must try to rest, but how can I? My husband is gone, and now I feel as though I am trapped in a nightmare." Miss Marple folded her hands. "I understand, my dear. It is a dreadful thing, and I fear the past is not as buried as some might have hoped." Mrs. Lonsdale stiffened. "The past?" Miss Marple observed her reaction carefully. "Margaret Ashford has returned to the village." There was a pause, just the briefest hesitation. But Miss Marple noticed how Mrs. Lonsdale's fingers tightened around the armrest of her chair. I see." Miss Marple kept her voice light. "Such a sad business about her brother Henry. I dare say you recall the incident?" Mrs. Lonsdale swallowed. "Yes, I was only a girl at the time, but I remember. It was dreadful. Poor Margaret. She vanished so suddenly after his death." Miss Marple nodded. "And now she has returned, seeking answers. And then, quite suddenly, your husband is murdered." Mrs. Lonsdale's breath hitched. "Are you saying you believe Margaret had something to do with it?" Miss Marple shook her head gently. "Not at all, my dear. But I do believe that someone feared what Margaret might discover." Silence settled between them, thick with unspoken truths. Miss Marple waited. Mrs. Lonsdale's voice, when it came, was barely above a whisper. "My husband. He was afraid." Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. "Afraid of what?" Mrs. Lonsdale hesitated. "A few weeks ago, he started receiving letters, anonymous but threatening. They spoke of Henry Ashford's death. My husband didn't speak of it much, but I could tell it troubled him greatly. He kept muttering that it was all coming back, and that he had to fix things. Miss Marple's mind whirred. Did he ever say who he suspected? Mrs. Lonsdale shook her head. No, but there was one name that seemed to trouble him, James Hawthorne. Miss Marple's expression did not change, but inwardly she took note. James Hawthorne, the man who had been Henry Ashford's best friend, and now the owner of a thriving estate on the outskirts of the village. A man who had, thus far, remained curiously silent about the entire affair. That evening, Miss Marple took a slow walk through the village, her thoughts occupied with what she had learned. The pieces of the puzzle were coming together, but there was still one crucial element missing. As she passed by the churchyard, she caught sight of a shadow moving near the gravestones. Instinctively, she stepped behind a hedge, watching. The figure knelt near a grave. Even in the dim light, Miss Marple could see the name engraved upon the headstone. Henry Ashford. The figure reached into a coat pocket and placed something on the grave, a small envelope. Miss Marple waited until the figure had gone before she stepped forward. Carefully, she picked up the envelope and opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper. I am sorry. I never meant for it to happen. Miss Marple's pulse quickened. The truth was within reach, and so was the killer, Miss Marple and the mystery of the midnight visitor. Section 9 Miss Marple stood in the churchyard, the small note in her gloved hand trembling slightly as the evening breeze whispered through the gravestones. The confession was brief, but it carried weight. Someone was apologizing, not just for Henry Ashford's death, but for something more. The phrasing was careful, almost as if the writer could not bring themselves to admit full responsibility. She glanced up. The figure who had left the note had vanished into the night, but their silhouette had been familiar. Though it was too dark to see clearly, Miss Marple was almost certain she had recognized them. This was no longer just an old tragedy. This was a carefully buried truth clawing its way to the surface. She slipped the note into her handbag and walked briskly toward the vicarage. It was time to speak with James Hawthorne. James Hawthorne's estate was a grand but slightly weathered house, its once pristine gardens now a little overgrown, as though neglected by an owner too burdened with other concerns. The heavy oak door was slightly ajar when Miss Marple arrived, and she hesitated for only a moment before stepping inside. The hallway was dimly lit, and the scent of pipe tobacco lingered in the air. A fire crackled faintly in the study just beyond, and as Miss Marple entered, she found James Hawthorne seated in an armchair staring into the flames. "I rather thought you'd come, Miss Marple." She inclined her head. "Did you, Mr. Hawthorne? And why is that?" He exhaled, the lines on his face deepening. "Because it was only a matter of time before someone started asking the right questions." Miss Marple took a seat opposite him. "Would you like to tell me what happened? 30 years ago." Hawthorne's fingers tightened around the armrests. "What difference would it make? Henry Ashford has been dead for decades, and now Lonsdale is gone too. The past should have remained buried." "But it hasn't, has it?" Miss Marple said, gently. "Someone has gone to great lengths to ensure that it never is." For a long moment, Hawthorne said nothing. Then he let out a ragged breath. Henry Ashford didn't drown by accident. Miss Marple's expression did not change. I suspected as much. He was pushed, Hawthorne admitted, his voice hollow. I was there that night. We had been drinking, all of us, Lonsdale, Ashford, and I. Henry was in a foul mood. He had just found out something terrible, something that shook him to his core. He confronted Lonsdale about it, said he had proof that Lonsdale had betrayed him. Miss Marple leaned in slightly. Proof of what? Hawthorne hesitated. Then, with a deep sigh, he answered, Henry's father had been blackmailed for years. Lonsdale was involved. Henry had found out, and he was furious. Miss Marple considered this. So, there was a struggle. Hawthorne nodded. A heated argument by the riverbank. Henry was enraged, threatening to expose everything. Lonsdale tried to calm him, but Henry wouldn't listen. And then Hawthorne's voice wavered. Then someone pushed him. Silence stretched between them. Miss Marple's voice was soft but firm. Who pushed him, Mr. Hawthorne? Hawthorne clenched his jaw. I don't know. Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. You were there. You saw. I saw, but I don't. No. His voice cracked and he ran a hand through his greying hair. It was chaos. One moment Henry was shouting, the next he was in the water. The current was strong that night. By the time we realized what had happened, he was gone. Miss Marple studied him. You have been carrying this secret for 30 years. Hawthorne nodded, looking exhausted. And now someone else has been killed for it. Miss Marple was quiet for a moment. Then she pulled the note from her handbag and held it out to him. Do you recognize this handwriting? Hawthorne took the paper, his brow furrowing. His hands trembled slightly as he read the words. His face paled. This looks like Margaret's handwriting? Miss Marple's expression did not change, but her mind raced. Had Margaret Ashford returned not only to uncover the truth, but also to absolve herself of a deeper guilt? She rose to her feet. Thank you for your honesty, Mr. Hawthorne. You have given me much to consider. Miss Marple walked back through the village, her thoughts swirling. The puzzle was nearly complete, but one piece remained out of place. Margaret Ashford had left a note on her brother's grave, expressing remorse. James Hawthorne had witnessed the struggle by the river, but claimed not to know who had pushed Henry. And Mr. Lonsdale, who had held a terrible secret for years, had been silenced just as the truth threatened to come to light. As she neared her cottage, she caught sight of a shadow moving near her garden gate. She paused. Miss Marple. The voice was low. Trembling, Margaret Ashford stepped forward, her face pale in the moonlight. I need to talk to you. Miss Marple nodded. Of course, my dear. Margaret hesitated. I think I know who killed my brother. Miss Marple's pulse quickened, but her voice remained calm. Tell me, Margaret. Margaret swallowed hard. It wasn't an accident, and it wasn't Lonsdale. Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. Then who? Margaret's hands clenched into fists. I think it was James Hawthorne. Miss Marple remained still. The weight of Margaret's words settled between them, thick and heavy in the cool night air. If Margaret was right, then James Hawthorne had spent 30 years hiding his crime. But if she was wrong, Miss Marple's mind clicked into place. Tomorrow she would reveal the truth, and the real killer would have nowhere left to hide. Miss Marple and the Mystery of the Midnight Visitor. Section 10, the drawing room of Colonel Weatherby's house, was filled with an air of quiet tension. The fire crackled in the hearth, but it did little to dispel the chill that hung over the gathered guests. Miss Marple sat primly in a high-backed chair, her knitting resting idly in her lap. Across from her sat James Hawthorne, his face pale but composed. Margaret Ashford was by the window, arms folded, while Reverend Peters, Dr. Bellamy, and Inspector Graves stood nearby, their expressions unreadable. It was an old-fashioned setting for a revelation, but Miss Marple knew from experience that a crime of this nature required such an atmosphere, a moment of stillness before the storm. "I have asked you all here," she began, her voice mild, "because I believe it is time to reveal the truth behind Henry Ashford's death and the murder of Mr. Lonsdale." A flicker of movement. Hawthorne shifted in his chair. Margaret's knuckles whitened as she gripped the edge of the window-sill. "I believe we have all assumed that the two crimes were inextricably linked," Miss Marple continued, "and in a sense that is correct, but the connection is not quite what we thought." Inspector Graves cleared his throat. "Miss Marple, I do appreciate your methods, but if you have something conclusive, it would be best to state it plainly." Dee smiled gently. "Oh, I shall, Inspector. But first we must dispel some falsehoods." She turned to Margaret. "My dear, you came to me last night and told me you believe James Hawthorne killed your brother." Margaret nodded stiffly. "Yes, and I still believe it." Miss Marple sighed. "I'm afraid you are mistaken." A murmur rippled through the room. James Hawthorne let out a breath he had clearly been holding. Miss Marple clasped her hands in her lap. 30 years ago, Henry Ashford did indeed discover that his father had been blackmailed. The culprit was Mr. Lonsdale, who had, I suspect, been extorting money from the elder Ashford in exchange for keeping a rather delicate matter quiet. Henry confronted Lonsdale that night by the river, enraged and reckless. Her gaze turned to James Hawthorne. "You were there, were you not?" Hawthorne nodded stiffly. "Yes, I told you that." "Indeed you did," Miss Marple acknowledged. "But what you did not tell me, because I believe you did not know, is that you were not the only one watching that night." Margaret's breath caught. Someone else was there. Miss Marple nodded. "Yes, and that person was the one who pushed Henry into the river." The room went silent. Inspector Graves frowned. "Who?" Miss Marple turned her gaze to the one person who had remained silent throughout the conversation. "Dr. Bellamy." A shocked gasp escaped Margaret's lips. The doctor, who had been standing stiffly by the fireplace, narrowed his eyes. "This is absurd," he said coldly. "I have lived in this village for decades. What reason would I have to kill Henry Ashford?" Miss Marple regarded him calmly. "You were always close to the Ashford family, were you not? A trusted friend?" Dr. Bellamy's jaw tightened. "Of course." "And yet," she continued, "it was not Henry Ashford's father who was being blackmailed. It was you." A hush fell over the room. Miss Marple nodded. "Yes, I believe Henry's father took the blame, likely to protect you. But Henry discovered the truth. And that night by the river, he intended to expose you." Dr. Bellamy's fingers twitched. "I believe you followed him that night," Miss Marple continued. "You saw the argument unfold between Henry and Lonsdale, and when Henry turned away, furious and ready to storm off, you saw your opportunity." She paused, her voice softening. "You pushed him, didn't you?" Dr. Bellamy's face was like stone. "You have no proof," Miss Marple sighed. "Perhaps not, but guilt is a heavy burden, is it not, Doctor?" Silence. Then Margaret spoke, her voice shaking. "And Mr. Lonsdale." Miss Marple looked at her. Dr. Bellamy had lived with the guilt of what he had done for 30 years, believing the past was buried. But when you returned to the village, Miss Ashford asking questions, you unknowingly put him in danger. She turned back to the doctor. Lonsdale, as it turns out, was not such a fool. He suspected the truth all along, didn't he? But as long as it remained buried, he kept quiet. Then Margaret began digging into the past, and he realized he had something to hold over you. Dr. Bellamy's lips pressed into a thin line. Miss Marple's voice was almost sorrowful. "He tried to blackmail you, didn't he? And so you silenced him." There was a long, terrible pause. Then Dr. Bellamy exhaled, his shoulders slumping. "I didn't mean to kill Henry," he said at last. His voice was low, hoarse. I just wanted him to stop. I was afraid." He swallowed hard. "And Lonsdale, he gave me no choice." Inspector Graves stepped forward. "That's quite enough, Doctor. You'll have to come with me." Dr. Bellamy did not resist as the inspector placed a firm hand on his arm. As he was led away, he cast one last glance at Miss Marple. "You always were sharper than you let on, Miss Marple." She gave him a polite smile. "People do tend to underestimate old ladies." Later, as the evening drew to a close, Margaret Ashford sat across from Miss Marple in the older woman's cosy sitting room. "I can't believe it," Margaret murmured. "All these years, and I never knew." Miss Marple patted her hand. "The past has a way of hiding itself, my dear, but the truth always finds its way through in the end." Margaret gave a small, sad smile. "Thank you, Miss Marple." "Miss—" Marple waved a hand dismissively. "Oh, no need for that, my dear. I simply paid attention." As the clock chimed softly, Miss Marple picked up her knitting once more. Outside, the village of St. Mary Mead settled back into its peaceful routine. The past had been laid to rest, and justice had been served. And as always, life moved on.